So, but people like Kaya Kallas are really trying to kind of maximize their role as a centralizer and a dominator of foreign policy discourse. And she is rabidly anti-Russian. As our chief European foreign policy person, we have somebody who absolutely despises Russia. Not only that, she wants to take on China after we've apparently defeated Russia. However, we're going to do that in the future.
This was Ian Proud, a former UK diplomat, consummate insider, master of the raised eyebrow takedown. I picked this segment for the intro because moments ago I published a critical expose about Kaya Kallas on Substack, and Ian's perspective ties it up perfectly. In that piece, I questioned the veneer around Kaya Kallas, the unelected Estonian power broker who is nudging Europe towards a two-front war with Russia and, believe it or not, China. A note of caution, that piece isn't a skim and scroll. It's a full tilt excavation. Names, numbers, leaked memos, the works, risk matrices, blind spot maps, blowback scenarios. In other words, if you can't sit still for more than a TikTok loop, you're going to drown. But if you're hungry for receipts, this is the dossier you might be quoting on your next dinner party. And speaking of velvet daggers, Ian embodies that classic English knack for sliding a stiletto beneath layers of courtesy. If you listen closely, you will hear the blade. Every measured phrase dismantles the official narrative, one polished syllable at a time. His quiet thunder dovetails with the hard facts in my article, turning abstract policy into something you can feel in your gut. Now, because evidence matters, every document and off-the-record interview we mentioned today is linked below in the description, and my article on Substack contains more than 25 sources too. Look at them, verify, build your own opinion, and then decide whether the mainstream story still holds water. So follow the breadcrumbs. And before you vanish down that tunnel, YouTube's algorithm doesn't exactly rule out the red carpet for dissent. Look at those screenshots. They're from long-time followers, magically unsubscribed, no click, no email, no nothing. When the system ghosts viewers for asking questions, you know you're circling the truth. So if you value unfiltered analysis, subscribe, like and share it anywhere the censors can't throttle the signal. Every click is a flare in the dark. And right now, flares matter. Ian Proud, what a pleasure having you. How are you?
Very good, thanks. How are you? How's the weather in the Netherlands?
Not very splendid, but I was in London, I think, last weekend. I came home with the flu and we had splendid weather, so I'm not sure if it's still the same.
It's very nice today, very nice. Another heat wave is coming our way, sadly.
Okay. Ian, so first of all, thank you very much for taking the time. I see you are really busy. I immersed myself all of this weekend now, watching as many interviews that you gave as possible. I saw that you were in Georgia. There was a conference and you had a joint interview with Professor Glenn Deason, who I also had on my show twice. So you come around, and what makes you interesting for me is that you have a very lucid view on the objective, on the realist situation of the things that are going on. Now, it would be tempting to discuss Iran to some extent, and we briefly touch it, but you are subject matter expert in regards to Russia. Why I'm saying this, and I have a couple of notes here. So first of all, you are, and please correct me if I'm wrong, you are a career diplomat from 1999 to 2023. And why am I saying that you're subject matter expert in regards to Russia? Because you actually served in the Russian embassy from 2014 to 2019, right?
Yeah, British embassy in Russia, yeah.
British embassy in Russia. Now, I said I would like to briefly touch on Iran, and we really keep it there because two incidents happened that had a similar fingerprint. And the first one was, of course, the strike on Russia's nuclear trident, the nuclear bombers, which were executed with smuggled drones, were smuggled close to the sites into Russia. And then we had the same scenario playing out in Iran, of course, where the initial air defenses were destroyed by a similar method. Now, I heard you talking that, and I had multiple other guests on my show who completely agree, that the fingerprints of MI6 and CIA are all over both scenarios. So what's your vision on that?
It's simply hard to imagine the Ukrainians on their own developing an operation of such complexity as that without any foreign assistance. I've not operationally been involved in the operation myself, but clearly, they would have had to have smuggled the devices in. They'd have had to have the means of satellite communications to actually operate them from some distance, away from Ukraine itself. Uh, and the weapons that went with it. I just simply can't see that the Ukrainians on their own would have the capabilities to do that without any external support.
I think Lavrov even said it. He's convinced that MI6 is behind these attacks, right?
Yeah, yeah, but I mean, that's a standard kind of line from Lavrov, of course. But we know that the British are very closely involved in supporting the Ukrainians militarily, politically, in other ways. So, yeah, I mean, it's not difficult to add two and two and make four. But I wouldn't want to speculate on it. But I mean, apart from to say that it's clear to me that the Ukrainians have had some help, and the biggest supporters to date have been the Brits and the Americans, and of course the Americans are kind of less engaged now than they were before.
That leads me right to the question, why is that so? I mean, my assumption is that Lavrov is actually right, that first of all, MI6 was behind this, but you just said it, that Britain has a long history of, how shall I phrase this, of countering Russian influence globally, right? So what, if we zoom out, why exactly is that?
Well, there's the kind of 2013, 2014 reason, and I suppose there's the kind of historical reason going back to 2013, 2014 at the onset of the Ukraine crisis. The Brits, were enraged by this. They saw this as blatant Russian meddling, even though it's obvious that the Americans and the Brits were kind of meddling in the domestic political affairs of Ukraine itself. And Britain decided to become the, biggest advocate in taking a hawkish line against Russia within the European Union at a time when the Americans, under Obama, at the time were sort of pushing a very, very hawkish line themselves, with people like Victoria Nuland sort of driving policy making there, and so on. So that was our moment to kind of step up and be the kind of super hawks within Europe on Russia policy. And after the first Normandy format meeting during the kind of commemorations for the end of World War II in France in 2014, that was the point at which we became excluded from the peace process, with Germany and France very much kind of leading with Ukraine and Russia. So without any particular role in the peace process to play, our main role became the kind of flag bearer for sanctions and the kind of driver of the hawkish policy pushed by the Americans.
I think there is a crucial point that you just mentioned, Maidan 2014. We had Victoria Nuland actually there. John McCain was there. We had the leaked phone call from Victoria Nuland, bleep the U, these kind of things. I interviewed Ivan Kachanovsky, who wrote his PhD on Maidan. He did a deep dive analysis, and there is no doubt that Americans were involved. He interviewed some of the snipers who told him that they shot on both the police and the protesters there. Yeah. So the view that we have here in the West, that we are fed here in the West, that one sunny blue sky day, Putin woke up in Moscow and thought, now I'm gonna invade Ukraine, is somehow flawed. And this is where your book comes in, A Misfit in Moscow, because you rectify this view.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that is the common view. Most people's view of events in Ukraine really only date back to February 2022, let alone February 2014 when the Maidan happened. Very obviously, the Europeans were trying to deliver some sort of peaceful resolution to the protests that have been ongoing really since the back end of 2013 after the Vilnius Eastern Partnership summit. And the Americans clearly felt that the Europeans were stepping on their toes. And shortly after the Europeans brokered this arrangement for Yanukovych to kind of gradually step away and actually hold new presidential elections and sort of, go through a process of constitutional reform, that completely got upended, and Yanukovych was ousted. He was smuggled into Russia, as we all know, and Putin convinced himself what he probably believed anyway, since what happened in Georgia in 2008, that the West were just bent on expanding NATO into Ukraine as it had tried to do in Georgia in 2008, and matters then snowballed, as we know, with what happened in Crimea, and what then happened with the separatists in the Donbass. But the idea that actually suddenly, as you say, Putin woke up one day with a grudge and wanted to seize Crimea and fund the separatists in the Donbass is a mere fantasy. I mean, the year before, actually, UK-Russia relations had been in a very good state. I've seen Putin in the UK at the G8 summit. Syria was a major complicating factor, particularly with Obama, but the UK sort of Russia relationship was in the better place it had been for actually several years since the Litvinenko sort of murder in 2006. So, this idea that Putin suddenly flipped, I don't think sort of bears real scrutiny for people who take the time to actually look at events as they unfolded.
I saw, whilst I was watching your interviews, I came across a channel where they claimed recently, like a week ago, that the next country that Putin will attack is Spain. Now, I mention this because this video had 500,000 views in a week. And then you look at the comments, they're seriously discussing, could that happen? How could it happen? When would it happen? I'm a behavior analyst. I find this fascinating. So this shows to me the deep indoctrination of the Western population in regards to everything related to Putin. They're so far off, it's hard to begin. It's hard to know where to begin.
Yeah, you couldn't even make it up, could you? But people still do make it up. I mean, people have been predicting Putin's imminent death since at least 2014, when I arrived in Moscow. There are all these kind of memes about the Russian army having to kind of recycle parts from washing machines to fit into their weapons systems because they don't have enough spare parts. I mean, they're just, Russia is going to invade Lithuania next, it's going to invade Latvia next, it's going to invade Estonia or Poland next, and now Spain, it seems. And every day there'll be some fantastical thing. The Russian economy is in meltdown and is going to collapse anytime soon. We're just subject to a blizzard of propaganda every single day of the week. And certainly in the UK, I'm not really sure what it's like in the Netherlands, but in the UK, the mainstream media just pushes this line every day without question, and it's quite shocking. But when you talk to ordinary people, I find people are open-minded actually to want to really understand the detail and the nuance and the texture behind everything that's happened. I think increasing numbers of people feel that they've been kept in the dark too, and that's starting to have domestic political ramifications here, but to a greater extent in places like Germany and Hungary, Romania, and countries like that.
If we zoom out and if we turn it around, so the first General Secretary of NATO, Lord Ismay, said this famous statement: the aim of NATO is to keep America in, Germany down, and Russia out. And there's a website, I believe it's called Lord Ismay Restated. And there's a list of similar statements throughout the decades from high-ranking politicians. So this is a view that I believe still lives in certain circles today. So is this a vantage point that we could view the Ukrainian war?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, personally, I think people overplay the kind of keeping the US into NATO argument, because the US makes billions and billions every year from weapon sales from NATO countries in Europe. So I don't believe for a minute that the US has any intention of pulling out, even if they want to kind of reduce their commitment to fighting any war with Russia, so they can focus on China. I don't really see any risk of the US pulling out. It's far too profitable for them, quite frankly. On the Germany question, that's a really big one, actually, because now we're facing a situation of rapid German militarization, remilitarization, after a period of very low investment in defense. By 2029, this is 6 years before this new NATO 5% commitment, Germany intends to meet it by 2029, which would lead to 120 or so billion euros per year additional German spending on defense. They already have the biggest army in Europe. If we're not worried about that, we should start to think about that and look back into the history books. But Russia out, I mean, that is the most clear cut one. Of course, not just NATO, but you look at developments like the Eastern Partnership framework. That was explicitly designed to keep Russia out and to try and coax in countries like Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, and countries like that. I mean, there's been no real sort of desire to kind of include and embrace Russia as an equal partner of the West, and now we're paying the price of that, not just because of Russia's militarization, but actually internally within the EU, the kind of pressures that's putting on the European project itself, which has become far too political and militaristic, and much less about the thing that made it successful in the first place, which was the economic, social, and cultural opening up. I mean, I grew up in Germany, just across the border from the Netherlands, and I'm old enough to remember still going for weekend shopping trips into the Netherlands and there being hard border checkpoints with passports being shown and that sort of thing. And that's not so long ago, actually. So I do worry about the European project itself. I don't think Russia has any desire, frankly, at all to invade us. The bigger risk to Europe is Europe itself right now.
I agree with you. I would not be surprised to see us going across the borders again with the passports standing in line. Absolutely.
Yeah.
The next potential candidate is France, yeah, but I don't want to digress. Yeah. But NATO and money, you just said it. So Germany wants to go up to 5%. I mean, this would be a massive wealth transfer from the German citizens. Where to? America, of course. So the biggest beneficiary of NATO, in my point of view, and please correct me if I'm wrong, has been America all along, because NATO basically is the tool that America uses to maintain its hegemony. Would this be a fair statement?
Well, yeah, I think it is. It gives Americans easy leverage, within Europe, and actually Europe is used as a springboard to kind of project American values and foreign policy priorities around the world. We saw that particularly with how the Ukraine crisis unfolded and how the Obama administration really used, the British government as their kind of mouthpiece within Europe to kind of really push the hawkish kind of Russia message. The question right now is how is that changing under Trump? Because actually Trump is much less, he's happy for Europe, to pay American arms, companies, but there's a kind of quite a clear ideological shift between the MAGA movement and actually kind of European neoliberalism, which seems to dominate at least the institutions of Europe. So that for me is the interesting question right now. How is that link kind of being broken down by the Trump factor?
There was a 180-degree change. So this, in my book, is a proxy war between the US. So the war in Ukraine is a proxy war between the US and Russia, instigated by the US. And I know I play devil's advocate and I make it very black and white, okay? And now it seems the US will pull out, at least to some degree, and the Europeans who were prudent at the beginning, yeah, Merkel and Hollande, they were prudent. Never mind Minsk, the betrayal of Russia via the two Minsk Accords. Yeah, they were prudent, and now it's the other way around. Now America seems to be more prudent, and the Europeans are more hawkish. What has changed?
What has changed? What has changed has been a few things. The increasing centralization of powers within the institutions of Europe. Von der Leyen's commission has more centralized powers than any other previous commission. The Lisbon Treaty, obviously back in 2005, with the creation of a single foreign policy role, that was very much seen as a bit of a sideshow under people like Josep Borrell, who's a fairly ineffectual character. But people like Kaya Kallas are really trying to kind of maximize their role as a centralizer and a dominator of foreign policy discourse. And she is rabidly anti-Russian. As our chief European foreign policy person, we have somebody who absolutely despises Russia. Not only that, she wants to take on China after we've apparently defeated Russia, however we're going to do that in the future. So we've got this dangerous person, ideologue, in Kaya Kallas, in an over-centralized, Europe under, von der Leyen, who has no interest in any sort of peaceful settlement with Russia. So that's one. And second is the changes of kind of figures in member state capitals. Merz is much less moderate character than than Merkel. Scholz was kind of drowned out, by the Americans. I think he tried to do the right thing at the start of the Ukraine war, but was very quickly sidelined by the Americans with the help of, the Brits, and so on. So Merz is in town. Starmer is, pumping his chest and, trying to play a big sort of, almost more Churchillian role than even Boris Johnson, which, if you think about it, is a pretty hard thing to do. So there are just some more hawkish leaders, within the key European capitals, being Berlin, Berlin and London, because London still is a European capital, even though it's not in the European Union. And Macron is just kind of blowing with the wind as he always, as he always does. So the Starmer and Merz thing, I think, is really interesting there. But the biggest problem is this massive over centralization of the institutions of Europe, where they've kind of lost their religion and they're focusing far too much on the external bit than actually Europe itself. And they really need to spend more time fixing Europe itself rather than trying to fix the countries on the periphery of Europe.
You just mentioned Boris Johnson. So Boris Johnson stuck out for me because he went to the conference in Istanbul and basically told the Ukrainians, "You will not stop the war. You will keep fighting." And Putin later showed on a press conference actually the signed. I don't know if you can already call it a contract, but he had the signatures of the negotiating team in regards to an agreement. So this war could have ended a long time ago. They have now. I have different reports, but 1 million dead. Yeah. So the Ukrainians, I should say, according to some sources, have 1 million dead. This is massive, and Boris Johnson to this day still defends his decision.
Yeah, he didn't go to Istanbul. He went to Kiev and spoke to Zelensky when the Istanbul agreement was already sort of ready to go over the line, it seems. And he's been honest about the fact that he discouraged Zelensky from signing it. So there's no real conspiracy there. Johnson has admitted this. The war that could have ended within 6 weeks of it starting. 6 weeks, just 6 weeks, more than 3 years later, we're still fighting. And the only people that are suffering are the Ukrainians. And of course, the Russians, as well. 1 million dead or injured. That increasingly is now accepted figure, isn't it? For this a needless war, and Ukraine is losing on the battlefield, and they don't have a population as big as Russia, so you're seeing increasing videos of parents or girlfriends and that fighting with recruitment officers on the streets as they bundle these young men into the back of minibuses to send them off to the front line. That isn't happening in Russia. This kind of busification thing that's happening in Ukraine right now. Ukraine is so short of manpower, they're beating up people on the streets and forcing them. We wouldn't stand for this in our countries. You wouldn't stand for this in the Netherlands if that happened. You wouldn't stand for it in the United Kingdom if our kids were being dragged off the streets by army recruitment officers and taken to war. We wouldn't stand for this in our countries. And yet nobody ever talks about it in the mainstream media in the UK. And I don't know what it's like in the Netherlands, but you never hear any discussion of this terrible thing that's happening, where Zelensky is so desperate to cling to power that he's beating up his young men on the streets and sending them straight to the front line against the wishes of their families.
In comes Trump and wants a ceasefire or a peace deal. Now, exactly because Putin, also Russia, is winning, and because they have seen already, again, Minsk 1, Minsk 2, what happens when they negotiate a peace deal with the West. There's no incentive whatsoever for Putin to, he knows what's going to happen, what would happen.
Yeah, he's got absolutely no faith in the West, and he doesn't have much faith in Trump because he's been here before with Trump, right? He had Trump 1.0 as well, back in 2017, where Trump came in wanting to improve things with Russia, and actually US-Russia relations got worse because Trump was so hemmed in by the blob and politics on the Hill in DC that he had no space to move. The US imposed harsh sanctions against Russia under Trump 1.0. So, there are limits to what Trump can do within his executive powers when he faces resistance in the US to actually kind of have a better relationship, with Russia. I mean, I think he's in a better place than he is today than he was in 2017, but nevertheless, he hasn't been able to wave the magic wand. And as you said earlier, he's facing a totally different politics in Europe itself, where there's absolutely no desire from the Europeans to make any concessions. As you say, any peace deal has to ultimately be between Russia and Ukraine. Both sides will need something to incentivize them to kind of reach, for peace. And the idea that Russia will just unconditionally lay down its arms when it's winning on the battlefield is a fantasy. And yet it's a fantasy that people like Merz, Mark Rutte, Keir Starmer, Kai Kallas continue to push every day that actually, Putin just has to agree to an unconditional ceasefire. Well, he's not going to do that. And anybody with an ounce of intelligence or who's been studying this event over the past, 3 years will know that he's not going to do that.
Mark Rutte, don't get me started. He's the former, for people who don't know, he's the former premier of the Netherlands. He's now NATO's Secretary General. I heard him talk diminutive about Lavrov. You wouldn't speak. So in business context, you would never speak like this. Yeah? Unbelievable. He said things like in years there was no sensible word coming out of Lavrov's mouth, etc. While senior diplomats I have talked to view Lavrov as one of the most seasoned and one of the most experienced diplomats out there at this moment. What's your vision on Lavrov?
Well, he's been around for a long time, which can be a good thing and it can be a bad thing. But on the good side, he knows everybody on the world circuit, right? So he's got a huge amount of experience of relationships with people from Asia through Latin America, Africa, and even actually Europe, even though nobody really talks to him in Europe these days. But actually, if you look at it from the perspective of the UK has had 9 foreign ministers since the Ukraine crisis started in 2014, and Lavrov's been here the whole time. So he's got that kind of consistency, and you see this actually with other kind of senior roles in the Russian government, like the central bank governor, the finance minister. These figures have been there, since the start, and they provide that stability in policy making that kind of Putin seems to really value. So yeah, he is what he is. He's very, very experienced. He's got incredibly good networks, and actually most foreign ministers in Europe haven't been around nearly as long as him, and frankly can't replicate the influence that he's able to deliver.
NATO expansion. So very often people say here in the West, NATO expansion has nothing to do with what's happening in Russia. Now, one of my favorite counter arguments is that William Burns, which was under Biden CIA's director, and he was ambassador in Russia, wrote in his memoirs, which I have somewhere behind me, that Ukraine joining NATO is the reddest of red lines for not only Putin, but his whole inner circle. So how can seasoned politicians in various Western countries still claim NATO expansion has nothing to do with what we see in Ukraine today?
Well, they claim it for the same reasons that they claim that Putin's going to die any minute and the Russian economy is going to implode. It's just part of the narrative. It's just the line they have to kind of say that it's got nothing to do with Russia, whether Ukraine joins NATO or whether Georgia joins NATO. But I mean that there is the fundamental flaw in the argument that you know Russia doesn't have any legitimate interests in actually saying who does and doesn't join, but that's simply not true. I mean, Russia decides what its legitimate security interests are, and if we don't agree with those interests, then we have to negotiate with Russia over them. Russia, for many years now, for almost 20 years, in fact, has had really expressed concerns about the expansion of NATO. This, goes beyond the not an inch more kind of declaration. This goes really back to the expansion of NATO to include the Baltic states and then Putin's Munich Security Conference. And this line hasn't changed. And Putin has said this on many occasions. He sees this as a major threat, and he's been ignored. Now, if we don't consider his concerns are legitimate, well, fine, but then we need to discuss those concerns with him rather than just ignore them. And unfortunately, we have ignored them, and now Ukraine has paid the price of that through a war which shows no sign of ending. So that this talks to another point that actually we believe that actually we've got nothing to talk to Russia about. It's not up to them. Well, that's diplomacy. Diplomacy is dialogue, and if you just cut off all dialogue, then actually you end up in the situation we're in today, which is an avoidable, frankly, proxy war with political pygmies like von der Leyen, Kaya Kallas, Friedrich Merz, even Keir Starmer saying, well, actually, let's just continue doing what we've been doing for the past decade and hope for a different result. There won't be a different result. We have to discuss Russia's concerns with Russia, whether we like those concerns or not, and find some way out of this terrible situation we find ourselves in today.
US Ambassador Just Freeman told me just 2 weeks ago he thinks diplomacy is dead, at least from his perspective.
Well, I mean, it has been dead for over a decade. We haven't pursued diplomacy with Russia since the Maidan crisis. The UK actively cut off direct political dialogue with Russia from that time, and apart from a few very modest attempts to rekindle, including under Boris Johnson when he was Foreign Secretary, is given up on dialogue, with Russia. So yes, diplomacy absolutely is dead. Lots of people think that if we talk to Russia, we're somehow signaling that we agree with their actions. Well, no, that's not what diplomacy is about. Diplomacy is about talking when you disagree. When you have the sharpest disagreements, that's when you have diplomacy. Diplomacy isn't recognition. Dialogue isn't recognition. It's something that you have to do to unravel the most terrible kind of knots we find ourselves in internationally, including wars that are going on for no obvious reason.
You just mentioned the 1 inch statement. So Gorbachev was promised when he gave up East Germany without a single shot, and I would like to come back to that. He was promised that NATO would not expand a single inch into Soviet influence sphere. Now today, many people even contest that this statement even was given. But a security archive, Washington University, I even know the folder. It's called What Gorbachev Heard. There are all the documents in. So there is no doubt that this promise was made from several high-ranking politicians to Gorbachev. Now we all know that NATO has expanded, and still people are saying that it has nothing to do with it. But what most people don't realize is, and I would like to get your view on this, the critical point is that we hardly hear is what the relation between the Second World War, East Germany, and what we're seeing today. Because it's very easy to think as a Western audience, America won the war. Well, from Russian perspective, that's not so. Russia sacrificed 27 million people. Yeah, they fought to Berlin. Yeah, and then they gave up without a single shot East Germany, where Putin was stationed, which is why he speaks fluent Germany. Yeah, and now we are saying they're our arch enemy. We, as the Western Europe, say now Russia is our arch enemy. Wouldn't it be smarter? This is the giant next door. Energy resources are rich, but of course that would be the strategic nightmare of the US. German know-how combined with Russian resources. It's kind of the geopolitical nightmare of the US.
It is, but it could be the geopolitical savior of Europe. Actually, this economic, intellectual, kind of cultural, social powerhouse could be, Europe if we actually opened up and tried to have a better relationship with Russia, and of course Ukraine, because we want that for Ukraine too. For all the mistakes I believe have been made on the Ukrainian side, on the European side. I've been to Ukraine many times. I want them to have that same prosperity too. They should be included, and I think Russia would want that as well. But for as long as we keep this kind of new Berlin Wall, if you like, this new Iron Curtain, that totally excludes any possibility of engagement with Russia, we'll never reach that. And the irony now is that the Americans are pursuing some sort of reset with Russia, while the Europeans keep slamming the door. It's quite, bizarre. I mean, as always, the Americans benefit whichever way, on this. They've got their massive NATO spending increase. They've got access to all of Ukraine's resources. They're going to have some sort of economic reset with Russia. It's Europe that is going to suffer from all of this, most of all, more than actually Russia. Long term, possibly more even than Ukraine, at least sort of economically. Once that hot can of Ukrainian membership of the EU suddenly lands on the lap of decision makers in Brussels, we could be so powerful if we actually just opened up our doors and had a normal functioning economic, social, cultural relationship with Russia. And the other factor is that we keep talking about China, but Russia sees China as just a bigger threat as we do, quite frankly. So, Russia could be a really good sort of partner for us, in terms of providing that strategic balance in the world, between Europe and between Asia.
The reason why I brought this up was, of course, Nord Stream, which is kind of the epitome of, how shall I say this? I don't want to use the word that's on my tongue, yeah. But clearly, again, according to many people like Jeffrey Sachs and others I had on my channel, the US is behind the attacks on Nord Stream. Whoever really executed this is pretty irrelevant, but all the indicators are there. Who is the beneficiary? Yeah, clearly, it's not Europe. So the self-sacrifice, and this is puzzling me as a European, it's puzzling me, the self-sacrifice the leaders of our countries
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I agree.
impose on their own populations on the example of Nord Stream. Maybe I should ask you first, who do you
Yeah.
think blew up Nord Stream?
Well, I think certainly the Americans, but I think ultimately is driven by the Ukrainians. That they've been arguing against Nord Stream, for 10 years, and
As did the
actually,
Americans. As did the
and
Americans.
so did the Americans, and so quietly, although we didn't really have much leverage, did the Brits. So yeah, I mean, the Ukrainians possibly with American support. Who knows? But I mean, as you say, the real beneficiaries from this are the Americans because very expensive American LNG is coming across rather than cheap piped gas from Russia, which is a crazy situation. And as you say, is Western leaders in like these little tin pot states like Lithuania and that saying, well, we're willing to take the sacrifice. You impose that on a massively complex economy like Germany, and you've got huge deindustrialization on economies like the UK. Even though we're not really that closely linked into the European energy network, we get a lot of energy from Norway. Um, we get the blowback from high energy prices on the European mainland, anyway. So we've had a cost of living crisis. We're looking to kind of cut benefits for disabled people, and now that's bringing into sharp focus in the minds of political leaders in Britain that actually you've got to make spending choices, and they've been choosing to kind of cut services for ordinary British people while continuing a proxy war, in Ukraine. It's completely crazy. We are losing out from this. Cheap energy from Russia is a no brainer. The whole over dependency was the biggest fraud, of the past decade that we've kind of convince people that actually we're too dependent on Russian gas. It's just gas. It's energy. I mean, Russia needs to sell its gas just as much as we need to use the gas. It's just gas, and people have been sold on the idea that actually, it's Russia's weaponized its gas. It's complete nonsense. It's just a product that it sells and that we need, and it sells it at a very cheap price. So why wouldn't we want to use that? It's totally self-defeating. But unfortunately, you look at the political leaders that we have, and I'm afraid I'm not surprised that they kind of make these bizarre and irrational choices.
And again, as a behavior analyst, I was interested to see how easy it was to convince large parts of the population that the Russian blew up their own pipeline, which was a sophisticated project. Yeah, there's nano coating at the inside. Yeah, on atom level, there is nano coating on this stuff too. This is not just some steel pipes on the bottom
Well,
of
as,
the
as
sea.
soon as soon as it had happened, people were blaming Russia, and there had been no investigation at all. And as soon as the explosion had happened, people were saying, "Well, Russia must have done this to punish Europe." And it was complete nonsense. The first thing I thought when it happened was, you know, Russia is probably the last person, the last country with any interest in doing this. It's more likely to be the Ukrainians, and that continues, frankly, to be my view. To this day, even if they had support from the Americans. I mean, it's just hurting Europe so badly, and the political leaders carry on with their heads in the sand.
Now, I have your Substack here. It's called The Peacemonger. I recommend everybody to have a look at it, but that could make you a target. And I'm saying something very specific here. May 20th of this year, there was a European Council resolution. It's called CSFP 2025/966, which basically makes dissent, which criminalizes dissent. Have you ever heard about it?
I know, but it doesn't come as an
You guys, of course, are no longer in the EU.
CFSP. Yeah, we no longer have CFSP. Thankfully,
Yeah.
we've got our own bad foreign policy, so it's all relative.
Okay. So whilst all this is going on, whilst we see an expanding war in the Middle East, whilst we see a never-ending war in Ukraine, the grip on dissent gets harder and tighter in Europe. In the US, I can't comment. And now we have this council resolution which circumvents any European court and criminalizes dissent. So a couple of things that can happen. There are already European citizens which are disallowed to return their own country. They can forbid you to travel. They can freeze your assets, any assets you have, which we already have seen in Canada too when we had the, farmers' protests last year.
Yeah.
So Trudeau simply froze everybody's bank accounts, these kind of things. Yeah. So we could even argue, I mean, in America, is there a trend in regards in direction of authoritarianism, and then we look how that plays out in Europe, even here in Holland. I mean, we have a right-wing party here, a very strong one. So where do you see this going? Both, and I know it's not a good idea to ask compound questions. So on one side you have a trend towards, and again I make it black and white, I know, yeah. We have a trend towards authoritarianism, and at the same time we see a tightening grip around free speech.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to backfire. Ultimately, it will backfire through the ballot box when voters are fed up with the governments of their countries taking decisions that penalise them at the expense of wars that they don't want to have any part of. So, the more we start to resemble the Soviet Union of the 1960s, the more I think, because we are still democracies as nations, that people rebel. You've seen that in Germany with the rise of AfD, as you said earlier. You could see that with France at some point. Wanting to leave the European Union. You've certainly seen that in the UK with the very rapid rise of the Reform Party here, which is like an alternative voice to the mainstream propagandistic, increasingly authoritarian, as you say, direction of this, government that we have here today. So I think it will ultimately backfire because we are still democracies, and I think when people sniff this increasing totalitarianism that we're moving towards as a fig leaf against their own kind of policy failings, ordinary citizens will, in greater numbers, say, "Well, we don't want this anymore. We'll frankly choose a different government and get rid of you and have a government that actually wants us to live in good relations with all countries of the world, not just with our kind of like-minded neoliberal woke friends."
But are we not seeing a global shift to the right? From Israel to America to Europe? Is that not what we're seeing?
It depends what you mean by the right. I mean, I tend to think of it more than between right and left, because I think the old right and left distinction has become slightly out of date. I think right at the moment you have this kind of tension between liberalism and nationalism. That's what I see happening, right now. And for too long, liberalism has branded itself as a moderate face of politics, and that nationalism is the extremist, or as they say, ultra right or far right, end of politics. But I think actually what's happening is a flipping of that narrative, and actually the nationalists, the people who put their national interests first, the countries that do that are increasingly the ones that want still to have good relations with other states. They want to manage their own national affairs and have foreign policy driven by their national interests, but they want to do so in harmony with other states. And it's the liberals, that actually aren't really putting their national interests first. They've got some wider exogenous kind of values agenda they're trying to impose on people by force, and the liberals are in fact the new extremists. I mean, that's my new thesis.
I'm looking at one of your articles. I think it was from June 17. It's called "With Trump Ready to Start World War III, Europe Needs a Revolution of Common Sense."
Yeah.
Maybe you elaborate.
Well, this happened on the back of a trip I had to Hungary, and the Hungarian Foreign Minister Peter Szijjártó gave the speech, and he spoke about the need for a revolution of common sense. And what it really is about countries actually developing policies that are in the good interests of their countries, economically, socially, culturally, kind of politically, and then foreign policy, emerging as a corollary of that, and that it's common sense that any country will want to have good relations with their neighbors, including Russia. It's common sense that any country would want to be in a situation of energy security where it can have access to the cheapest available sources of energy. It's common sense that countries would want to have some control over migration, such that the interests of their citizens are put first in terms of the labor market. It's common sense that countries would want to have kind of social policies that promote long-term stability of the population and that sort of thing. So governments increasingly need to be driven by common sense considerations of what are the policies that are going to be in the interests of their country, that help their country to kind of thrive, to help their people become prosperous, that maintain the safety and security of their borders and those sorts of things. Then actually there's been with Ukraine as a perfect case study, there's been an absolute abandonment of common sense, by the people in charge. So that's basically, we need to get back to dialogue, good energy policies, policies that promote the interests of your own citizens above the citizens of other countries, and that sort of thing. And that's just like a nationalism. It's not extremism. It's just like, well, foreign policy, when you strip away the hype and the propaganda, even if you look at the Ukraine war, foreign policy always starts and ends at domestic policy. And that's why Ukraine is losing, because every member state, however much they've wanted to support Ukraine, has always been constrained by their own domestic considerations. And actually, the more we get back to those kind of common sense considerations across the board, the more likely we will be to kind of solve problems like Ukraine and actually not allow them to happen again in the future.
But it doesn't really look like that at the moment. At least Europe is pulling out of the war in Ukraine. I heard they want now. Lagarde was talking about 800 billion a year to pump into Ukraine, and it's supposed to be privately funded, whatever that means.
I know the 800 billion is this rearm plan that von der Leyen has been pushing. That's over several years. And that includes the 150 billion loan scheme that the European Commission is pushing as well. But yeah, I mean, Ukraine needs 40 billion a year at least, and that's all going to come from Europe. So European voters, when their governments come to them to make cuts to their social services and their health and their education services, increasing numbers of citizens will say, well, actually, why don't you cut military aid to Ukraine and stop the war instead? And I think that's certainly what we're very slowly starting to see happening in Britain.
Now, opinion question, yeah. Could those wars, what we see, the expanding war in the Middle East and the war in Ukraine, Russia, could they merge? And I'm asking in the context of Brzezinski, who already wrote in 1998 or warned about driving Russia in the arms of China and Iran. He specifically mentioned those three countries. And I think, again, it was US Ambassador Josh Freeman said, now today they're even more stupid. He said that word, yeah? They even now included North Korea, a nuclear-armed North Korea. Yeah. So could there be a scenario where these two regional conflicts merge on a geopolitical level?
I don't think so. I mean, I don't think that Russia wants that. I mean, I think Russia's playing a big balancing game with the BRICS grouping and how that's expanded, but that's all about moving to a position of geostrategic balance with China, India, Russia balancing each other, out. And obviously, Iran has now joined that as well. BRICS is based on coexistence of countries that are essentially sort of competitors and adversaries with each other, and that's the kind of that's the trick of it. I don't see that China has any interest in actually getting involved in any wars in Europe, even though the Chinese may see some benefit of the weakening of Russia from a continuance of the Ukraine war. It's not entirely the case that China supports Russia, sort of come what may. I don't really see at this stage. I don't really see scope for merging. I mean, Russia may provide more material support to Iran, but that's bounced off by Putin's desire to sort of build on this kind of gradual thawing of relations with the US. So I mean, I think the Russians are good at kind of balancing relationships, and I think we're not good at doing that. In fact, we're terrible at doing that. We've driven a foreign policy in which we have to take sides between one or the other, and that's the complete opposite to what the Russians do, where they try to kind of live in balance with competitors and adversaries, China, India, Iran, and so on.
But could China really afford to lose Iran? I mean, lose Iran's oil? Could they really afford that?
I don't think there's any risk of that happening, at least not in the short term. I mean, thinking long term, you start to get into real crystal ball gazing. I mean, with
No,
BRICS,
we could. Sorry, we could be very specific. Regime change. Yeah, that's the stated goal
yeah,
in
no,
Iran, right?
of course, but actually, all the evidence so far suggests that actually the US strikes, which didn't really seem to have any clear plan attached to them, have, if anything, they kind of mobilized Iranians around the
Sure.
regime they've got. So yeah, I mean, theoretically long term, but that doesn't really seem likely to happen anytime soon. And now Trump is giving up on Israel in Gaza by the looks of things and pushing for an end to that terrible kind of situation there. So I mean, there's no strategic value for the US in, you know, they may want regime change in Iran, but they're not going to fight boots on the ground a war in Iran over it. I mean, they'd be crazy to do that, and then they're certainly not going to do it for the benefit of Israel either. So yeah, I mean, it would be bad for China to lose the Iranian oil theoretically, but I just don't really see that risk that bright on the radar, frankly, anytime soon.
Can we still discuss, because you brought it up, BRICS?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is the new global kind of movement, and it's really about getting back to the fundamentals of the UN Charter. Really, it's about countries living in peaceful coexistence despite the messiness that exists on the world stage. I mean, the UN Charter didn't solve the messiness of the world map. What the UN Charter did was give countries, you know, a destination, a venue where they could just live with that messiness and sort of discuss their differences in a peaceful way. And BRICS is essentially trying to do the same thing. It's not judging any member on their internal political systems. It very much focuses on the kind of the easy stuff, the economic, social, and cultural side of things, which is increasingly appealing to countries that want to escape from this pick and choose kind of Western style diplomacy where you're either with the West or you're against them. I mean, actually, countries want to kind of have good relations with everybody, and I think that's what BRICS is trying to do. That's how it's trying to position itself. It's a venue for countries to come as equal partners and just focus on areas of mutually beneficial collaboration. That's where the G7 has gone wrong. That's where the EU is going wrong continually, and the Americans at the moment still figuring out what their role is in the world under a chaotic Trump.
BRICS is often discussed together with de-dollarization. Yeah? So, meaning those countries switching to an alternative global system, which would undermine the U.S. Dollar as world reserve currency. And Trump already said, I mean, I don't know if he can if he can prevent it. That's not gonna happen. And every country that will no longer use the dollar, we stop trading or whatever. But technically, known the depth of America, what was it, 300 trillion now? It's more than
Yeah.
the GDP, America's GDP. Knowing also that China is the largest holder of American debt. I mean, I find this brilliant. America was able to sell their debt to another country, and the only reason why
I think
China
it's
doesn't
Japan
buy
actually. I think it's
the
Japan,
bonds.
China second, but yeah, but the huge, huge
Okay.
hold. Yeah, yeah.
Huge. Yeah. So basically, the only thing BRICS, Russia, China would have to do is sit and wait and smile.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the economics will figure itself out. Trump, what he ultimately wants is a weaker dollar so that he can sell more US exports, so that he can give jobs to blue collar workers, which are his main kind of support base. There's no way, even in Trump's imagination, that the US is going to get to a position where it has, these massive kind of trade surpluses because the dollar is too strong. Now the dollar's become weaker, but what we saw with the tariff wars was actually countries started spooking the US market by dropping their treasury bills and that sort of thing en masse. And actually, lots of people think the Japanese are doing that actually more than the Chinese. But the point is, I mean, that is the US system, and actually it creates bigger kind of vulnerabilities on the US side than on the Asian side. I mean, China has the complete opposite economic model to the US. It's driven by exports. It has investment coming into the country and domestic investment, too. So I mean, they can deal with the shocks of shifts in trade caused by tariffs because they have such huge reserves of capital in the bank anyway, which the US doesn't have. So they're in a better position to absorb those kind of shocks. And so they're gonna, as you said, they're gonna wait it out because they don't need to make huge concessions to the Americans. They've got money in the bank and the Americans don't. So yeah, it's and that's why I think Trump quite quickly backed down on the China tariffs because he realized that actually, bluster aside, he didn't have the greenbacks to back up his bravado.
Provocative question. Could it be? I mean, I could go out on the street now. I ask 10 people, and 8 of those 10 people would tell me, let's say Trump would also has tariffs on China, then China will pay the tariffs. And I'm pretty sure the same is true in the US. Could it be? Could it be that Trump himself didn't realize that Americans will pay the tariffs and not China?
Well, exactly. I mean, I think he's possibly overestimated um, the ability of his country to take the pain, and that's where the political systems of both countries kind of really play into this calculus. I mean, the Chinese people will just accept the pain. I mean, China's not a liberal democracy. The Chinese Communist Party will manage the shocks by injecting funds here and there where businesses fail and that sort of thing. The Americans don't have that luxury. That they will kind of face resistance in the ballot box in a much, which will be felt in a much more immediate way by Trump than any dissent that happens in China. So democratically, I think the US is just less able to kind of deal with this turbulence, because when US taxpayers pay, then at some point they're going to increasingly blame their own government who actually started this policy in the first place, and that's a consideration that weighs much less on Xi Jinping. Another reason why he can sit tight.
Ian, you have been generous, very generous with your time. I really appreciate it. Whilst you have some renovations going on, so I know you're very busy. Before we end, is there any topic that is close to your heart that we did not bring up?
Not really. I mean, the key thing is about diplomacy and the need to get back to to diplomacy. For too long, for over a decade, we've abandoned talking with the people that we most disagree with. And actually, when you disagree with people, well, that's the time then when you need to talk to them more. And we see that very clearly with Ukraine, but we also see it to a certain extent with China. Over the issue of Taiwan, we see it with Iran and that sort of thing too, over the nuclear program. We need to get back to that kind of culture of diplomacy where we try and resolve our differences in meeting rooms, not on the battlefields. And until we can get that, we're just going to see Europe in particular sort of continue this spiral of decline, to the benefit of Asia, but also sadly to the benefit of the US as well. And we need to kind of break that cycle and actually genuinely have a European voice, which is comprised of however many kind of independent sovereign states that put their national interests first, but want to kind of live in coexistence with each other. Until we can get back to that, we will continue this secular decline of Europe with potentially disastrous consequences, longer term, shattering the peace and stability that we've worked so hard for since the end of World War II.
So again, Ian, thank you for your time. I would like to one more time mention your book, A Misfit in Moscow. Again, it's an alternative view on the current reality, which is basically the main topic of this channel. Ian Proud, thank you for my time. It was my pleasure talking to you.
Great talking to you too. Let's do this again sometime.
I would love to. Bye.